Hello, everyone. This is James Valvis, channeling the ghost of Edgar Allan Poe to give his opinion on important matters, large and small. And today I want to talk about tolerance, the great leftist virtue of tolerance. And I call it a leftist virtue because even though it rises out of Christian virtue, it is not a Christian virtue in the sense that it's the end result of the virtue. The end result of Christian tolerance is love. Love is a great virtue. It is the ultimate purpose of Christian virtue. Tolerance next to love is a flimsy thing. Anyone can tolerate almost anything for any length of time, but to love someone, that's a whole different story. Or to love something, that is a whole different thing. You can tolerate your neighbor's dog. It's another thing to love your neighbor's dog. You can tolerate your neighbor who is being a horrible person, and another thing to love that person. It's one thing to tolerate a racist and to love that racist. Those are two different things. We can even get our heads around tolerating somebody who's a serial killer or something, and at least to the point where we don't want to execute them or whatever. But to love them is an extremely hard thing to do. And so love is a much greater virtue than tolerance, and that is the Christian ideal. That is the thing that in Christianity you must strive for. Now, it's very hard teaching. I mean, I think of, when in the Last Supper, when Jesus was handing out the bread and wine and saying, "This is my body and this is my blood," the apostles looked at each other and said, "This is a hard teaching," because basically it's at the least symbolic cannibalism. And if you believe in the miracle of transubstantiation, as I do, then it is actually eating the blood and body of Christ. So it's a hard teaching, and this is also a hard teaching of Christianity, that you're not only supposed to tolerate people that you don't necessarily like, but you're supposed to love them. It is not an easy thing to do. Sometimes when people say being a Christian is easy, it's such an easy thing to do. And you get heaven for this, and you can just go out and then confess your sins, and then you're all cleaned from your sins, and it's such an easy, carefree life. No, it's not. Christianity, done well, done it properly, is about as difficult a life that you can imagine choosing, because a lot of stuff is counterintuitive. And when Jesus says, you've been told to hate your enemy and love your friends, but I tell you it's different. And you love your enemy and do good to those who despise you. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially on a consistent basis. You might get away with it once, and you backslide in other ways. And I found it's hard to do this. It's hard to live a Christian life. It's hard to be a Christian. So back to tolerance. Now, tolerance, therefore, is a flimsy shadow virtue of the secular society based on Christian love. It's a dumbed down version of Christian love. So the Christian would tolerate the Muslim, or he would try to love the Muslim, or he would try to love the Buddhist, or he would try to love the Jew, or he would try to love. He wasn't always successful, but that was the goal. Tolerance, in its leftist conception, is hardly a virtue at all, because in order for there to be real tolerance, in order for you to really be practicing the virtue of tolerance, I told you it's a shadow virtue. It's not as great as love, but it's still a virtue. It's a virtue to tolerate things that you don't control, to tolerate other people's freedoms, to tolerate other people's different choices or different lifestyles. There's some degree of that virtue of Christian love in that lesser love of tolerance. And it says, I love you enough to let you move away from God, or I love you enough that even though I think that your freedom may in some way endanger me in the future, I will still allow you to have that freedom because I believe in freedom of conscience and I don't want to tyrannize you. So it's still a virtue in its true sense when there's real tolerance. And what do I mean by real tolerance? Well, it's tolerance of something you disapprove of. That only makes sense. A lot of times when leftists talk about tolerance, they don't mean tolerance at all. They always mean they're tolerant of things that they approve of. So they're tolerant of homosexuals. But you ask them, do you disapprove of homosexuals? And they say, of course not. Of course I don't disapprove of homosexuality or homosexuals. Well, then you're not being tolerant, are you? You approve of it. It's like me saying I approve of beautiful women, or I approve of a sunny day. You don't need, if you wanted to go hiking with your daughter, you don't have to be tolerant of a nice sunny semi-warm day. You have to be tolerant of the blizzard. You have to be tolerant of something that that you didn't like or weren't expecting, or think is a disadvantage to you in some way. So in order to practice tolerance at all, you have to have disapproval. But now the leftist runs into trouble here because he says to himself, don't be judgy. Don't judge other people. You can't judge. And so if you can't judge, if you're not supposed to judge not lest ye be judged. That scripture is so misread. That's maybe a whole video by itself. But, the whole idea is not to judge people. And you don't want to be judgy unless they're judgy themselves. That's the only thing you can judge is those judgy people. You can hate the Christian because he judges, but you can't nobody else. And so the thing is, if you approve of something, you're not really tolerating it because there's nothing to tolerate. It's like me saying I tolerate my wife. I don't tolerate my wife. I love my wife. I may tolerate something that she does that I don't like. But again, you're moving into, disapproval, something that you don't like. And believe me, she tolerates a lot more about me than I do about her. But this pseudo virtue that they have, and I'm talking about the left, where they congratulate themselves for tolerating things that they approve of or that they like, is so silly. It's like sort of like patting themselves on the back for not being racist. Well, this is, why? It's like patting yourself on the back for being able to, breathe. This is not an accomplishment. This is, in 2018, the United States of America, being a non-racist toward blacks or, other races, Asian or Hispanic or whatever, Eskimo, whoever knows what it is. It's not an accomplishment. It's par for the course. It's just, who isn't? Who isn't a racist? Or who claims to be a racist? Very few people. They're in the far extreme and they're not even in the Overton window. They're way out there. The real racists, the ones who will admit it and be open about it, and even accept it among them in themselves. Those people are far outside the mainstream. And so the idea that you're bragging to yourself about that is silly. And it's the same with tolerance. Tolerance for things and people that you have no problem with is not tolerance. It's just accepting what you already approve of. That's not a virtue. That's not anything that anybody can do. And so in order for you to really practice the virtue of tolerance, even the dumbed down version of Christian love that tolerance is, you have to be able to tolerate something that you don't approve of. And when we look at the left, the political left, and I'm not just talking about America, but across the world, and when you look at some examples of the extreme right, and when you look at many of the extreme theocratic movements, and I'm talking about, the Wahhabi Muslims and some really debased Christian sects. That's sex with an SCCT, not X. Those people are not practicing tolerance. You have to be able to disapprove of something before you can say, I'm tolerating you. And so when you say that you're a tolerant person, and yet you want to force the Christian baker to bake the cake, I don't know why you'd want to do that anyway. Believe me, you do not want people making people food when they don't want to. They can do anything to that food, from make it not as beautiful a wedding cake as you want it to be, to spitting in it. Okay? You just don't want to force people to make you food. It's a bad idea. It's a bad idea to make people associate with anybody they don't want to associate with. The KKK comes in and says to the black guy, make me a cake. What do you think that black guy is going to do to that cake? Use your brains for a change. I mean, come on. But anyway, if you don't approve of that Christian baker, then you're no more tolerant, you're less tolerant than the Christian baker is. If you want to drive him out of business, that's not tolerance. You're tolerant. Oh, I'm so tolerant to the gay person. Well, congratulations. Do you have a problem with the gay person? No, you don't. But you do have a problem with the Christian person, and you're completely intolerant toward them. And that's the same goes for anybody. Anybody in any way you look at it. You can only really claim the virtue of tolerance if you're tolerating somebody whose opinions you disagree with. And it's almost always opinions. The idea that, I tolerate black people. Well, congratulations. Who doesn't? Unless you're a complete moron. So when it comes to differences of ideas, you're not seeing that on the left. You're just not. Not anymore. It used to be. It used to be the left was tolerant in this way. They were tolerant in this way because they were not ascendant and triumphant in their cultural domination. And this happens with every movement. It'll happen to the right too. Right now, the right is completely out of power. I'm talking culturally. Donald Trump is president and that kind of thing. And so you have the right has some political power. But political power is not as important as cultural power. Cultural power is far, far more important. When you look at the poetry world is overrun with leftists. It's monolithic. You can almost not even get a word in edgewise. There's just almost nobody out there who's even a moderate. I mean, who's of any. If they exist, they're in deep hiding, because it is 100% a leftist art, and that's not good for the art, by the way. And so in order to advance real tolerance, you have to be able to tolerate the things that you don't like. But anyway, as I was saying, the right itself, if it ever gains cultural power, will turn against real tolerance, just as the left has. So this is a power issue so much as more than it's a left-right issue. However, as we sit right now in this space and time, a person who wants real tolerance of ideas, a real diversity of thought, has to stand against the left. He has no choice, because the left has become a cultural tyranny, and it has tried to silence and smash all dissent and any kind of opinion it doesn't like. Just recently, we saw an article in the New York Times calling free speech advocates free speech extremists. This is an absurdity. There is no such thing as a free speech extremist. Now, there are certain kinds of speech that are illegal, defamation and screaming fire in a crowded theater or something of that nature. But outside, child pornography would be considered criminal speech, because a criminal act is taking place within that the context of that quote unquote speech. But for the most part, unless it's a criminal act or it's criminal in nature, speech is inviolate. Speech is, you have to, in order for you to call yourself a tolerant person, you have to be in favor of free speech, and free speech across the board for everybody, for the racist, for the bigot, for the homophobe, the anti-Christian, the anti-atheist, the you know the person who hates Muslims, the person who loves Muslims, the person who wants to, who thinks that killing Muslims would be a great idea, the person who thinks killing Christians would be a great idea. You have to be able to tolerate even the extremes of this, because that's what it means to be tolerant. And the more you're able to tolerate things that you vehemently disagree with, and I'm not talking about agree with them in the sense that they're able to do them. Obviously, you don't want to. You don't want somebody going around randomly killing Muslims, for instance, or randomly, doing horrible things to gay people or whatever. But the idea that you could tolerate that person within a society is necessary so that you don't end up in a tyranny. You have to be able to accept those extremes within the confines of the law. Now, that means that those people have certain unalienable rights, and those rights are inviolate. You can't touch them. You can't stop these people from speaking. Not even in a protest sense. You can't shut them down. You can go out there and protest or hold up a sign or something, but you start stopping people from going into the event, or you're burning down the place, or you've made it so that this event cannot happen, then you're not in the spirit of true tolerance. You're not. And you don't. And if you take away, if that's the kind of thing that you're involved in, then you're fascistic. You're a person who needs to be stopped if we want to have a free society. And if you want to, if you are such a person, and if a movement becomes that, and that's what we're seeing from the left, we're seeing a movement that has moved beyond. They have gotten so much power in the culture that they have moved beyond any rational or reasonable complaint, and now they have moved into tyrannical mindset. And they've stopped arguing their ideas. In a lot of ways, the Obama administration and the Obama years was terrible for the left, absolutely terrible, because what it taught them is that at every argument, every opinion that is put out that disagrees with them, they could just scream racist. They could just scream racist again and again, racist, 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 and they could just scream that, and that's all they had to do. And so, like any other muscle, if you don't have your argument muscles toned and well defined, you get sloppy. And ultimately, now a lot of people on the left, they've won so thoroughly in the culture, so they've gotten just about everything they wanted that was reasonable. Okay, and so now when they move into wanting things that are unreasonable, they not only don't want reasonable things, but they can't argue in favor of them, partially because they're not reasonable things to want in the first place. It's not reasonable to say you want to be able to let any man ever hang out in the little girl's bathroom. That's not reasonable, okay? It's not a reasonable position to have. It's reasonable to say that if a transsexual person goes in there and they don't bother anybody and they go to the bathroom and they leave them alone. But it's not reasonable to say that you can't have any rule at all that limits the access of men to young girls in a setting where they're naked. That's not reasonable. It's not reasonable to say you can let young, horny, testosterone-filled boys who are dressing as girls go in and into locker rooms with girls. None of that makes sense. None of that's rational or reasonable argument. And if you do want to argue that, if you want to argue with it, you have to be able to do something other than scream transphobe, you hate transsexual people, you're a horrible person. You have to be able to make an argument above and beyond that. And what you're seeing from the left is that they're unable to do that because they've lost the power to build the ability to reason out arguments. And that's what always happens to whatever side has the power, because they don't have to argue. They can just decree. And it's one of the reasons they're so upset about losing the Supreme Court, because what does the Supreme Court do? It just decrees things. Like it just decreed gay marriage. There's no reason why they should have done that. Look, it was going to win in the polls eventually anyway. Everybody knew that. Everybody could see the direction it was going. And Anthony Kennedy just decided, well, this is one way I can be a hero in history. I'll just do this. But it's really just a decree. It's not a republic. Then you're not making an argument for it. You're just decreeing it. You haven't won people's minds over to the argument. You've just declared it. And that's what the left is used to anymore. They're used to just declaring, we want this, so give it to us. And they get it almost all the time. They almost always get everything they want. And at the same time that they almost get everything they want, they sit there screaming hysterically about how the new fascist menace is going to come and make this country have the same politics it had in 1996. And so, when we talk about tolerance, you can almost not even talk about the weak side, the conservative side, the Republican side, however you want to define it, the nationalist side, however you're defining the weaker side of the current paradigm. That side is always more tolerant. It has to be, because if it's not being tolerant, it cannot survive. It has to preach tolerance. And that's what the left did through the whole counterculture. That's why you had the free speech movement in Berkeley. That's why you had all these movements for assembly, and they were such defenders of free speech. And it's why they're turning away from these liberties now, because now they're in power. Now they have control, and now they're the establishment, and now they're becoming McCarthyistic. They're becoming just like the Red Scare right was in the 50s. They're the same exact mentality. They have different politics. They have different political allies, but they are no different than Senator Joe McCarthy. They are the same kind of mindset. And so, when you say that you're a tolerant individual, are you really? If you're on the left and you're listening to this, are you really a tolerant individual? Have you defriended me on Facebook like hundreds of people have because I hold moderate opinions on almost everything? I have leftist opinions on some things, like the death penalty. I'll get to that eventually. Torture, I can't stand it. I'll get to that eventually. And child endangerment or corporal punishment of children, which I absolutely loathe, and which I think is just horrendous that conservatives defend it. And then, of course, I have some views that are conservative, some that may be considered libertarian, and I have some views that are moderate. And the only real far-right view that I have, the only view that I think is really on the right and very strident in its opinion, is abortion, which I think is the greatest tragedy and the greatest horror show of modernity. I think it far exceeds anything we've seen in the past. Nothing compares to it, not even communism. Communism killed 100 million people, but abortion is worse. I don't know how many people abortions killed, but in this country alone, it's 60 million since Roe. So 60, 65, something like that. I mean, like Stalin once said, a few million are, a statistic, and one person's a tragedy. But I don't know how many it is at this point. It's somewhere between 60 and 65 million in this country alone. But you got to remember that China had a one-child policy. So any number of, and the average woman in Russia has 9 abortions in her lifetime. 9 abortions per woman. I mean, it's one of the reasons why they have a replacement rate of like just over 1. Russia, people worry about Russia as a world power. Don't worry about Russia. Russia is gone in 2 generations. Putin is paying people to have babies. He's refused to let other countries adopt Russian babies because Russia is dying. They're aborting themselves out of existence. Don't worry about Russia. There won't be a Russian left in the world at the turn of this century. That's an exaggeration, but it won't be anything near. They'll just be a tiny country as far as population goes. So yes, if you want to call yourself tolerant, you have to tolerate things that you disagree with. And if you, in order to be tolerant at all, you really need to be in the controlling paradigm. You have to be ascendant in the culture and at the peak, or at the power player in the culture. And then you get to say you're tolerant because you're the one who can suppress the speech. You're the one who can suppress assembly. You're the one who can suppress freedom of association. You're the one who can go around and do whatever you want to do in public when other people have to hide their opinions for fear of having their cars keyed, or their children attacked, or their wives molested, or whatever is going on. Their signs taken in there, and it's all kinds of garbage, and get punched in the face, and pepper sprayed, and beaten down and punched. And you're the ones. The left is in control of the tolerance in this country. And if you don't find a way to be tolerant now, I guarantee you, this is not a guess. This is an inevitability, just like it was an inevitability when the right could not be tolerant in the 50s. It flips. It always flips. People cannot live where people are not tolerant. And so they always go to the other side. And of course, they don't think that the other side is going to flip too, and they will. So it's up to you. It's up to the people on the left. If you want to stay in power, if you want to continue to dominate the culture, well, then you're going to have to find a way to be tolerant of the people that you disagree with. You're going to have to publish their poems, and you're going to have to publish their short stories. And you're going to have to frequent their movies, even if you disagree with their politics. And you're going to have to eat their hate chicken if you like it. And you're going to have to just say, you know what? Sometimes people disagree with me. And that's okay. That's all right. It's okay if somebody doesn't want to be involved in a gay marriage. That's okay. Really, it is. Gay people will survive that. It's not the end of the world. 2 of my best friends in the world are gay. They're tough guys. They'll make it. They've survived far worse. Far, far worse. So have I. So listen. This is my challenge to you. Go out there and practice the tolerance that you used to preach. And thanks for listening. And God bless you.